welcome back to Cocktail Party Economic Conversations. We're covering Chapter 8 from the book Cocktail Party Economics, looking at market forces. And it's really a great pleasure to have Evan Siddall as our guest. We're going to talk a little bit about the housing market, for which he probably knows quite a bit about. So thanks, Evan, for being here.
Delighted. Glad to be back in Guelph virtually. This is not Guelph.
Hi, Evan. I'm Rick Maranta. I work with Evie on Cocktail Party Economics. Welcome to this segment. I just want to ask you a few questions about yourself. And I think a lot of people have sort of questions about Canada Mortgaging Housing Corporation that you're the president and CEO of.
Yep.
I'm not exactly sure what you do, but maybe if you in layman's terms sort of explain what you do and like how the corporation makes money and all that kind of stuff, and then maybe just a bit of a background of how you got to where you are from Guelph.
Sure. Well, I'll start with CMHC. And the old book on CMHC was that we had this commercial business, which was mortgage insurance and securitization, and a non-commercial business, which was assisted housing. And in U.S. parlance, that'd be like Fannie and Freddie on one side and housing and urban development on the other. But we've actually unified the company in terms of what we actually do. What we do is promote housing affordability in Canada. And we use those different things, those different programs and capabilities to do that. As for my own background, I graduated from the University of Guelph undergrad in '87, went to law school, did not practice law for a moment. Well, that's actually a bit of a lie. I spent one summer around here at a law firm, and then I went into investment banking. And after investment banking, I spent a little bit of time with the Irving family in New Brunswick, and then found my way to the Bank of Canada to work with my friend Mark Carney. And after that, to CMHC, which is what I've been doing for the last 7 years.
Great journey. So you went to University of Guelph. So what was that like there?
What was Guelph like?
Yeah, at that time.
Yeah, it was, probably in a lot of ways the same as it is today. I was speaking to a friend whose daughter is actually just joined the vet school. And, Guelph it's a university town, and we have few of them in Canada. Great place to live, wonderful intellectual environment. And it was different for me as kind of a nurturing university. And I had the opportunity to rediscover that as a member of the board of directors some years later. I think deepened my appreciation for what Guelph is and my pride in having been there.
Yeah, so you used the word nurturing university?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting because actually, my both my boys went to Guelph. I went to Waterloo, but I think that's one of the reasons that appealed to them there seemed to be nice people there. And Evie's a great recruiter, of course. I don't know how many people she's recruited in our circle, but anyways, yeah, that's an interesting word, nurturing. I like that.
Yeah. And,
Yeah. Well,
my experience, sorry,
go
Abby.
ahead. I was just going to say that this fall, more than any, given that COVID has happened, trying to be nurturing in a virtual climate is kind of tough.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard as a leader, as a CEO, to do the same thing because we do try to have a nurturing culture at CMHC. I was just going to make reference to Evie and say that I'm sure my microeconomics undergrad prof was Brenda Whiteside, and Brenda
Hmm.
ended up being in administration and was a very real friend, and probably was for me during my time one of those nurturing people who really was a touchstone for what Guelph meant to me.
Yeah, well, it's great when you get an economics prof that can kind of do that for people. So
Yeah,
it's kind of nice.
yeah,
So, so I was thinking about, intro, micro, and, basic concepts. And I thought, I know with your tenure and housing right now, I just thought I'd ask a couple questions about the housing market in Canada because it's pretty, I think people find it kind of scary.
yeah.
So, because they don't know what's going to happen, what do you see as sort of the major forces that could be changing housing over the next bit?
It's hard. Look, it's hard to predict, and we're in the business of needing to try to predict. It's hard to predict because the forces of supply and demand that affect the housing markets, because after all, in a sense, while they're connected, you can't pick up a house in Guelph and sell it in Toronto. It's a distinct market. And we may delve into these factors affecting supply and demand. But, and the other thing that's really fascinating is the classic supply and demand that we used to thought about that we used to think about is changing because of behavioral factors. And the Adam Smith rational person doesn't exist in our market, and therefore, when you seek to understand economics, as we all know, human behavior and psychology is a huge, huge part of that. On the back of COVID, we're seeing many, many manifestations of that from a demand point of view and probably supply point of view too.
So, in what? Give me an example. Like, what do you mean?
Yeah. So, for example, people are working away from the workplace. I happen to be in my office right now, in my office space in Toronto, but it's one of, I think, 5 days I've spent in the office since mid-March. And people are finding their ways out of the city and into the country, into more bucolic, pastoral kind of places. And so that's shifting the demand. Places like Collingwood, Muskoka, the Laurentians, where I spent some time in the summer, they're hot, hot markets. Uh, and the other factor, which continues to defy me, is that we have deferred an economic adjustment that's got to happen as a result of this pandemic. Bars, restaurants, tourism, travel are all going to change. We won't lose those industries, but they're going to have to conduct themselves differently. But government income support measures have deferred that mercifully, frankly, because it came at such a personal cost in terms of unemployment. But that unemployment's going to happen, and unemployment leads to reduced demand for housing. We haven't seen that. The combination of income support and very low interest rates and the promise of low interest rates for a long time have actually juiced housing demand in the short run.
Mm-hmm.
So, are you worried about a housing bubble?
Well, in my job, I'm not allowed to use the B word. I mean, I'm allowed, but I'm still responsible to use the B
Oh,
word. But I will say, I'll say this. We forecast the beginning of this crisis because we thought we needed to. A range of peak to trough change in average house prices in Canada of between 9 and 18%. 9 based on a base case, and 18 based on a very severe W-shaped COVID kind of pandemic, which we have not seen yet. And we said it was worst case. Of course, everybody said Siddall's predicting an 18% decline, which is not what we said. But that peak to trough number, all things being equal, has gone up because the peak's higher. And that's just math. Now, it may mean that the trough is higher too. So we haven't done that work yet, but the peak has certainly gone up.
so housing has basically gone up because people still have income because the government has given some income supports um, in place. So we didn't get the drop the way. And then I know that moving out of Toronto, definitely you start to see housing prices are going up
Yeah.
from people saying, okay, we can work from home permanently. And so let's get out of Toronto and
Yeah.
cash out and move somewhere a little cheaper, which
I guess
I
the
think is sort
interesting
of reasonable. Like that's a rational thing to do, wouldn't it be?
Sure, it's a rational thing to do. It's a very rational thing to do. But when unemployment manifests itself, and it's got to, we've got
Yeah.
north of a quarter of our labor force on income support. Like at some point,
Oh,
it's huge. Um, and we haven't seen significant delinquencies in unemployment. We haven't seen significant foreclosures, also because CMHC and the private mortgage insurers have deferred mortgage payments. There's something like 14 or 15% of Canadian mortgages are not being paid. Um, that like those are fundamental economics.
No, like think about the dominoes. Like my mind just keeps on going on all this stuff because you order food and you think my son worked down in Toronto, right? And he doesn't buy food. I cook him food all the time now, but in Toronto he'd go out every day and have lunch. But so all those businesses, they're not going to have all their customers. So
That's
like just the
right.
domino effect. Eventually, it's like a wave, right? Eventually, it's going to hit you, right? So to me,
It's going
it's
to
a
happen to
kind
commercial
of
real estate. Restaurants they can't afford to pay the rent they used to pay. So something's got to give, and it's costs, and that's people at the end of the day. So and we never said that this adjustment would happen until late in this year. Um, for those reasons, we knew the income support measures were in place, and we knew the government would succeed in deferring the economic adjustment. But you can't kick a can down the road forever. and and there will be some kind of adjustment. So we'll see.
Oh, it feels like, oh, I was hoping for a light at the end of the tunnel, and it looks like it's just a train coming.
Yeah, there's a bunch of things that have us concerned in terms of other factors we haven't talked about. Immigration's fallen off. Immigration has been a significant source of economic growth for Canada, significant, hundreds of thousands of people a year. That's basically nothing now because our borders aren't open. There may be some pent up when that's released. There may be some pent up immigration that we restore, but there's a bunch of factors that's all on demand side.
I was going to ask you about this. So our friends are buying a house out in St. Catharines, hopefully, if it goes through. But so we went down and visited, and it was being sold by Purple Bricks. That kind of model, Purple Bricks. They sort of
No,
like no. They sell like private. I think it's private, and they have a different model. I don't think they're like a normal.
du proprio, so probably the same idea. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I was just wondering because I heard that they were leaving Canada or they're going under or whatever. To me, that would be like a more attractive thing to happen these days, right? With
Yeah,
real estate.
there are a bunch of fascinating. So where's real estate going? There's a bunch of fascinating real estate tech businesses out there. Home sharing, for example, right? You have work sharing, you could have home sharing. Um, we've got we actually have enough housing in Canada to house everybody in Canada. We've just got it in the wrong darn places, and some people are overhoused. My wonderful mother is single and lives in a 3-bedroom home, right? And she's bought it. She's allowed to live in that, but that is a form of inchoate housing supply we haven't capitalized on. And one of the things we're trying to do at CMHC, because our goal is housing affordability, is, for example, we're starting a product called Home Match, where it's an app, and we will match for people with houses they want to have occupied with people who need them. So think of a student at the University of Guelph and a senior in Guelph, and you've got to make sure privacy laws are respected and people are safe. But it's a way of managing the supply demand imbalance that exists in different places, and therefore containing unnecessary increase in demand and therefore increase in prices.
Do you feel like, I mean, I was just thinking about, what's the, I never used it, but what's the one where you can, rent a room in a, like
Airbnb.
Airbnb? I know it's having, I mean, lots of people bought condos to be Airbnb'd and now they're realizing they can't make money at it.
Yeah.
Given this event, I think it's pretty significant. What do you see never coming back? Like, what's a structural shift that you think is not, once it's all over, we drift back, maybe new people, not this, some people lost, some people won, but we'll basically go back. But what do you say is, you just don't see coming back?
Yeah, I'm not in the never. I will answer your question. I'm not in the never definitive game, and I don't believe this new normal thing will certainly shift, but there will be some reversion to what we want to do. Will Airbnb go out of business? I actually don't think so, but it won't be as robust as we thought it was going to be because the costs of maintaining a hygienic place to rent and the risks associated with a place with high turnover and hotels, those have changed. So those business models have to change. I heard about this fascinating idea with restaurants, for example, where people are crowded into a small space, and the way to run a restaurant was multiple tables, multiple turns, and you had to pay for a bunch of things, including staff. Well, what if there's a British model where you go and you just go order your food and you go order your drinks, and you actually don't have wait staff, things like that. I think there'll be subtle changes in how businesses run in the long run that affect it. But never coming back, Evie, I wouldn't want to be that definitive.
Yeah, so you think, well, there might be some slight structural changes, but there's no, something's never coming back. I worry a little bit about that. Because you go around downtown, like small town places, or you downtown, and you realize stores have closed, and you need this critical mass of stores to get people. Like I was at the mall this morning, and none of them are opening at the same time, all the stores. Some are opening at 10, some are opening at 11. So how do you get this? everyone's showing up. And I went, oh, wow, this is actually real. This coordination problem is actually a real problem. So I said, how come all these stores aren't open? They said, oh, they don't have the staff. And I was
Yeah.
like, what? I don't understand. I was completely confused.
Well, okay, that's a fascinating story. So CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, actually pays people a fair bit of money, and that was deliberate. But in many cases, it's a disincentive to work, right? Now,
Yeah.
it's certainly going to change. But we designed these programs to deal with a freezing economy. They weren't designed to deal with a thawing economy. And so they're probably going to be more expensive to thaw than we thought. And that's probably okay. That's probably okay because the massive economic cost and in people terms would have been intolerable otherwise.
You know, that what you just said, I have a friend across the road where we get our Thai food. It's a Thai restaurant, and you know, I talk to the guy whenever I go in, and he had to close a couple of nights on Fridays and Saturdays because he lost his cooks to serve. I mean, he had a job for them, but it was better for them to stay on serve. So he had a hard time. They're struggling. Work. He said he was working 14-hour days. So yeah, that's just an example of
Well,
Yeah.
CERB is ending. I mean,
yeah, yeah.
that's not going to keep going. And so
My
people,
pad thai's coming back.
yeah, well, they might be more open more. But I guess getting back to the housing, you start to see that the housing is kind of a basic need. It's
Yeah.
certainly, when you look at homelessness, the first thing to try to get people back into society is get stable housing, right? Housing is like the first kind of rung to a civil society. Do you see any issues in Canada with respect to getting really affordable housing across the country?
Well, now, how much time do we have?
Well, yeah, we have a little bit. I think what you're going to say is important, so we have a little bit of time. I
Yeah,
mean,
I'm just underscoring the importance of that question and the centrality to what we do at CMHC and what I've spent my time on. So um, there are a couple of particular problems with housing in economic terms. One is that demand is very elastic and supply is very inelastic. And what that means is, in a cocktail party economics kind of way, is that new demand boosts prices in the short run consistently because there's no supply response. It takes too long to build a house and to get approvals and all that stuff. So we need to change that. We need to work with municipalities to accelerate approvals for affordable housing. We're trying to do that. And then the other thing is we've got to try and inelasticize the demand function. So we need to try and contain unwanted demand. The mortgage stress test, the mortgage interest stress test, is a way to take the stimulus of low interest rates and detune it a little bit, so that the demand response isn't quite as immediate. Now, low interest rates, we're seeing it in massively increased prices, but um, both of those things are policies that help moderate the effect on housing affordability. But there's a lot. We have as an objective, our company, we've declared this what we call a big, hairy, audacious goal, which is that by 2030, everyone in Canada will have a home that meets their needs and that they can afford. And the place we have to start is with vulnerable populations. You look at how this crisis has affected seniors in long-term care, has affected Black and racialized people distinctively from people who look like me, and we have yet to resolve the confounding problem of Indigenous people in this country. And so, until we address these issues with vulnerable people, we're going to have a massive problem with housing affordability in our country. And have you got it right? It is a crucial enabler in somebody's feeling of belonging and inclusiveness in our society. A guy called I'm just blanking on his name. I'll get his name in a minute. Wrote a book called Evicted, and he said without stable housing, everything falls apart.
yeah.
Yeah, true. It's a core thing. Yeah, it's one of Maslow's basic.
So So are you involved in the types of housing that gets built? Like, I mean, as you get older, right, you start looking for like, bungalows and different things. Are you part of that? How does that work?
That's no, we're not. And the reason, Rick, we're not is because that's a little Politburo-ish. We want the market, the planned economy stuff. You don't want some middle-aged white guy in Ottawa, right, deciding what
Right.
Guelph needs from a housing supply point of view. That's a little deterministic and a little overplanned. That
Right.
market will be driven by developers and people in that market. Um, but what we do is we finance people through a program called the Rental Construction Financing Initiative. We have these great titles for our program.
Which I'm
And
sure
it's
has an acronym that's
Right.
RCFI
Exactly.
impossible to say.
and RCFI, and it funds new rental housing. So it's aptly named. Anyway, what we do is we give low interest loans to developers who promise to rent the units they buy for less than market median rents. And so we do stimulate affordability that way.
Hmm.
Yeah, well, you think about the housing market and you realize that there's a lot of pressures on it, and then you could just quickly be evicted. So that becomes an issue. And now we have rental where, okay, you put laws into place so it's difficult to be evicted, or even in this case, now people are not paying their rent. That really gives a disincentive for somebody to say, let me build an apartment building. Like, because you now have actually policies that make it sort of difficult for renters or for landlords to actually collect rent. So I look at it from their side too. Like, why would I want to go into a business which seems to have this very weird cash flow if they choose not to pay?
Yeah, so, I worry about it too. And you remember early in this crisis, people were hoarding toilet paper,
Yeah.
and that felt it's just hoarding, and hoarding is something that's very antisocial. Well, not paying your rent, if you can afford to pay your rent, is also antisocial, because you're harming the risk, the generalized risk associated with building a rental building or owning a rental building, and someone's going to pay for that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very big concern. I worry about because rental, not everybody needs to own. Rental is a like my mother went from owning, and now she lives in a long-term senior's apartment and she rents. Like, there's no
Yeah,
reason for someone at her age to be owning a house. She doesn't need to. Renting is a viable and actually positive net present value option for a lot of people. And so we don't need to have everyone owning their own home.
that's right. We have extremely high levels of home ownership in Canada. People take me as anti-home ownership. I'm actually not anti-home ownership. I'm anti over promotion of home ownership, which some people in the residential real estate business do to line their own pockets,
Mhm.
precisely for the reason that you say that rental is a form of secure tenure. It's a I rent, and it's a perfectly fine way to live. But there's just so much support for ownership, and in part the government's policies, and I mean federal, provincial, municipal, territorial, um, have made the problem a little bit worse because we've overstimulated rental overstimulated ownership versus rental.
What
And
about the banks? What about the banks? Like this was something my wife's an accountant, and I remember looking for our first house, and the bank said, "Oh yeah, you can afford twice as much as what my wife figured out on our spreadsheet," right?
yeah,
And I don't know, you know what I mean? Like it's like sometimes I think, yeah, if you eat oatmeal, you can afford a certain level of house, right?
this is a critical, crucial point you're making that people don't understand. So what they'll do is they'll point to real estate mortgage losses and they'll say, "There's no risk. There's no risk in these mortgages." At a microeconomic level, that's true. So if CMHC insures a mortgage, we are going to have very, very few losses. Canadians will pay their mortgage. How will they do that, however? They won't buy a car. They'll eat oatmeal instead of steak. What they'll do is they'll economize on their consumption. Consumption is 58% of our economy. So if I over lever to buy a house today, what I'm doing is I am bringing forward future consumption dollars to buy a house today, which means I won't spend it in the future. Over leverage has been proven to be a drag on future income, future growth. And at something like, so the Bank for International Settlements did a study, and a couple of terrific economists called Mian and Sufi wrote a book called House of Debt, similar analysis. The BIS work says that above 80% debt to national income, you have a drag on future growth. We were at 99% last December. Our current numbers, based on deferrals and all that stuff, are that Canada's above 115% right now. That's a problem. That's a real problem. And that's why CMHC is not anti home ownership. We're actually pro home ownership, pro affordable home ownership, because pushing debt levels so high and prices so high has a cost, and we haven't had that reckoning yet.
No, well, that's kind of what happened in the last housing crisis, right? In 2008, is that people were underwater, like their house was worth less than their mortgage. So and in the
Yeah,
US, I know the rules are different than in Canada. In Canada, it's harder to walk away from your mortgage. In the
that's right.
US, they were just walking away.
You can
So
throw the bank your keys. In Canada, you
that's right. So I think that in terms of the housing market, I guess this podcast is being recorded in the summer of 2020. It'll be watched
forever.
fall of 2020, 2021. I'm really hoping people are looking back on this a couple years from now going, oh, that's how bad it was back then. It's gotten a lot better. But I worry that this drag they're going to be feeling it still in like a year, 2 years. Your modeling, do you see any quicker recovery, or do you think this is going to be a slow coming out?
Yeah, we actually we do a bunch of economic modeling on the housing market, certainly, and we do a lot of scenario planning because we have a view, which is kind of obvious, but people don't do it, that uh, predictions are a loser's game. Now, whatever you predict, you're going to be wrong. Better you set yourself up for a range of different scenarios and think about what that means, and therefore run your business accordingly. So, we've got some wildly negative projections, and we've got some pretty okay projections, and we're modeling all those.
That range doesn't sound so good.
Yeah,
Well,
it's not an awesome set of facts. Not an awesome set of facts.
I
oh
got a
dear.
question of I have a question. Um, so what has driven the pricing of houses up so high? Like, I mean, this is just from my own experience living in Oakville. I live in a townhouse, small
Yeah.
townhouse. And back, a number of years ago, we were looking at, a detached house. So we'd go and it was like 100 grand more. And we were always going, really, do we need that? But then, the gap between what people sold those houses for and what you can afford now has just gone crazy. So do you have any sense of what's driven that so high?
Yeah. In basic terms, I'm going to give you something unique about housing in a second, but in basic economic terms, it's this point about inelasticity of supply versus elasticity of demand. The elasticity of demand part demands some conversation. Supply is just slow. And part of the reason it's slow is we're running out of land.
Mm.
Land is now 75 to 80% of the cost in our big cities of homes. We're not making new space for single family dwellings. And growing horizontally isn't working. We have to grow vertically, right? So what we have to do is increase densification. That is the solution to housing affordability. On the demand side, housing is a funny thing. I challenge you to think of an asset that is consumable, you use it, investable, you can invest in it, and tradable. Healthcare is investable and consumable, you can't sell it. Education's investable and consumable, you can't sell it. And because of that, it's really given to compounding demand effects that can promote boom and bust cycles. And so housing's a very funny thing. And the problem when you're in the middle of a boom cycle is it looks like trees grow to the sky, and they just don't. um, Somebody once told me, I actually think it was Mark Carney, that of the 46 financial crises globally for which we have housing data, 2/3 of them were preceded by boom and bust cycles in real estate.
Oh.
I just saw the look on Evie's face. She's like,
So if someone's tracking, if we have a student watching this and they start tracking real estate, it might actually be a good ace in your back pocket when you're trying to do some predicting about what you should pay for a house in a
yeah,
particular market.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
because all these kids are gonna have the same. They're all facing the same thing. Like I know my kids are like 28 and 29, and they're going like, we're not gonna. You can't afford a house. We're not gonna be able to afford a house ever, right? So,
right. So the propensity to rent has shifted significantly in places like Vancouver and Toronto, and that's
hmm
the right response. That's
hmm
the right response, right? That's a rational Adam Smith kind of thing to do.
It's a good substitute.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now you were said earlier, you said you had something else you wanted to say about housing that you thought was important.
Oh, it was this boom bust thing that
Oh,
I
okay, so the boom bust is a really important issue. Well,
invest
when we're
in consumer.
taking a look at markets, and there are markets for detached houses, condos, rural, city.
Mhm.
So these are multiple markets that might be close to each other, but they're not perfect substitutes. So, yeah, you can't move a house that you really love to the location you really like,
But you can move yourself,
but
right?
you can move yourself.
You can
Yeah.
live here where I am at King and Bay, or you can commute from Guelph. Um, and this is another really fascinating thing about it in economic terms. So, is that a good thing or is that not a good thing? Because if I live here in downtown Toronto, I don't need a car. If I live in Guelph, I for sure need a car. And we found that people who live outside of urban locations and suburban locations actually double their greenhouse gas consumption. Housing is something like 10, 11%, just the housing envelope itself in terms of emissions. It doubles if you're outside of an urban location. So when I talk about the need for densification, growing up instead of out, that cost is not just economic. It's actually, I mean, if we were to fully price carbon, we would be more driven to denser living.
Mm.
Right. Yeah, which is what
The
Europe.
reality that, in economic terms, that's not priced in yet into what we
Yeah.
do.
Yeah,
Wow.
interesting. We value our space though, eh? Somehow in Canada, in North America, we yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that housing has is it's this HGTV phenomenon. It's very romantic. We start nesting. We
No.
start dreaming about taking out this wall and painting this color, and
Yeah,
suddenly this home is not just an investment and consumable, it's actually a reflection of our personality. Somehow it becomes part of our identity where we live. They've shown that in this recent crisis with having students at home, it has really realized income inequality because people are on Zoom calls and some people are at the cottage on their deck taking the
yeah,
call, and
I
somebody
hate
else is in an apartment that has like lots of people, and you're trying to find a corner where you can shine your video camera against a blank wall. That
yeah.
this is really revealing that people have very large income inequality. Um, that is a concern. Now, the US is bigger than Canada. Do you have concerns about income inequality with respect to housing and what that means?
It's essential. Yeah, absolutely. I really do. And you're talking about within one cohort. Well, think of I'm at the very beginning of Gen X, 1965 is the year I was born. My son's, of course, a millennial. The chance of him having the same kind of wealth as me is much lower because of housing. Because my gains in housing, our gains in housing, is their cost. Um, and so that is housing's a big deal just between generations.
Mhm.
And the amount of money that's been made on housing is promoting inequality. If Canada represents anything in the world, it's tolerance, social mobility. For goodness sakes, we don't have it perfect. We have racism here too, um, and inequality. But as someone once said, we have the world's cleanest dirty sheets. If we don't get this right, and housing is a key enabler because of the uniqueness of housing. If we don't get it right, then what we think we stand for is more fragile. I think it
Yeah.
really matters a lot.
Well, I think that's a good spot to leave people reflecting. Um, this has been a really great conversation.
For me
I
too.
Yeah.
feel like we've covered a lot of ground, and thank you for your perspective. I think it really, yeah, I think what's really nice is you're a nice person. Sometimes people always think of economics as this, hard nose, money, money, money. You're an investment banker, money,
Yeah,
money,
yeah.
money. And yet you have this heart that says, let's figure out what we can do for people to make their lives better. And I think that that's a good attitude to have and very Guelph.
Very
Very
well.
well. Oh, that's a yeah,
Very
very
Guelph.
pure quoting
Yeah.
accents, very well.
We,
So thanks for joining us.
you're very welcome. It's been my pleasure. And if I've contributed a little bit to your students' understanding of housing, I'm delighted.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you so much.